It appears that, there is some optimism about the economy, as we were discussing earlier. But I think that there's some concern about the steps that China is taking, which would appear to be designed to mitigate or not mitigate the effect, but the apparent effect, let's say, of the spread of the virus in China. They've, of course, stopped reporting daily fatality totals. They have actually redefined how they define a COVID death. It now has to be specifically respiratory plus COVID positive, whereas before it was just death that was COVID positive, which incidentally is how the rest of the world has always defined it, and the way that China has always defined it when it's talking about the rest of the world. So there are questions out there about what the real economic shakeout is going to be and what the real human cost is going to be.
Yeah, in terms of people going back to work, in terms of supply chains being in order, in terms of people simply choosing to stay at home and not really participate fully in the economy, I guess all that will play out. Interesting, Japan's response. I mean, you've got to wonder why Japan thinks people coming from China with COVID are any more of a threat than people coming from London with COVID.
Not only was it interesting, but it was interesting how quickly it occurred. It was very quickly they turned around. As soon as the travel rules were changed, Japan was right there on it and said, okay, well, if you're coming from China, you have to have a certain test. You're right about Omicron, right? We know that Omicron is not, certainly people die from it, but it's not, one of the more deadly strains. I guess, Japan also has an older population. They're going to certainly take that into account. There seems to be a widespread sentiment within Japan in general about having travelers come back in. And a story that we just did this week shows that actually Japan is at the top of Chinese people's wish list when it comes to where they would like to travel. That's not new, but it shows that there's an appetite to go there.
Yeah, I saw one of the global monitoring companies that checks on the spread of pandemics in all contexts. But in the context of COVID, they were saying that in China, the variants are two of the milder Omicron ones at the moment. They're not seeing any mutations as such. And, the Chinese are saying that hopefully mutations, as we have seen in the past, tend to be less damaging than previous iterations. So there's a reason to be relatively optimistic that China won't be severely derailed or infect the rest of the planet. But you can never be sure about these things, right?
That's precisely it. We can't be sure. And there are so many variables. You're right. And by the way, I'm glad you said that because that's been understated, underdiscussed since 2020. That mutations tend to get less deadly, not more deadly. And that's something that people really have never talked about very much. That's a big variable, clearly. Another variable for at least the domestic picture in China is that the vaccines there don't work as well as the vaccines that most of the rest of the world using, the mRNA vaccines that are now available here in Singapore and the Western world and other places as well. And then just the fact that, I heard somebody describe this the other day as the largest experiment in herd immunity in human history, 1.4 billion people. People raised eyebrows when Sweden did it. Remember that? When Sweden decided that they were going to go it alone, we're going to just go ahead and live with it. That's 10 million people. So we're talking about an experiment literally, 1,400 times bigger than that. It's just wide open. We just don't know what's going to happen.
The real imponderable here, to a large extent, is how they're going to deal with the health implications. Should, if the vaccine is not up to the task, and should the implications on health in the country be manifested in visits to the hospital, in mortality and that kind of thing, the potential for that to have real economic impact is the one really unknown element of this whole thing, isn't it? I don't know if we're hearing any reports from China about hospitals being overwhelmed, about the need for greater health care attention and what that's doing to the economy. Have you seen anything there?
Not from established news organizations. On Twitter, you can go follow somebody like Eric Feigl-Ding, the Harvard-trained epidemiologist, who, is posting images that are horrifying about that are supposedly the inside of Chinese hospitals. There are stories about running out of oxygen. And you're right. That's where, the treatment aspect and keeping those caregivers healthy. New York City learned this the hard way. Having enough oxygen on hand to treat older people who, would survive with oxygen, but might not without oxygen. These are, again, we're getting back into, just how many variables are, but just in the treatment part of it, and the fear factor, and thereby the economic impact that would stem from that. Unknowable.
Yeah. Complex situation, though. Then we'll see the effects as we go on. Just quickly, what else are you following on CNBC.com?
Yeah, we have a number of things that are drawing attention this morning. So I mentioned a moment ago the Chinese tourists. We have a story about the countries that Chinese tourists are most interested in visiting right now. Just within, I think it was half an hour of the change in rules where it was announced that Chinese would be able to leave the country, the Trip.com reported a 3-year spike in interest among Chinese tourists. And those countries they want to visit include a lot in Southeast Asia, but it's Japan, South Korea, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Australia. The United States, actually, are among the countries that they're seeing the most interest in. Also, the G7 price cap. We have a story from Elliot Smith in London where he's discussing how it does appear, or at least a finance official in Russia indicated to reporters yesterday, that it is creating problems with their exports. It is going to bite in and perhaps create a worse deficit situation for Russia.
One story that I saw that I thought was really interesting and I've seen very little coverage of elsewhere is the story about some of the leaders of some of the smaller countries around Europe talking about why we should be getting away from looking at GDP as the determining factor of our economic policies.
That's right. Sam Meredith, and also the London team, wrote that story. That's interesting. Even among economists, there have been many who have said that GDP growth is a pretty blunt instrument. What is it really capturing? That's the I think, valid criticism of the metric. And, the metric does have its shortcomings for sure. On the other side of the debate, you have people who say, but to try to insist that we remove the profit motive, excise the profit motive from individuals' motivations is, it would require us to be an entirely different animal. We've not seen humans behave that way before, ever. And there are actually people in this article who say explicitly we need to get away from the profit motive. So it's a little bit, the proposals are a little gauzy, a little bit, happy.
But it's the element of organization amongst some global leaders having a conversation and deciding that this is actually to be on the agenda that is a little bit new. As you say, we've talked about it for a while in theoretical terms.
Yeah.
But no one's actually sort of started saying, well, maybe we should act on that idea.